The first photo showed a wall that wasn't supposed to be gone. The second showed my brother standing where that wall used to be, holding a coffee and smiling like somebody had just handed him the future. And the third photo showed a set of architectural drawings taped to a dusty window. My drawings. My name was in the title block. My old office address was underneath it. And on the windowsill, half covered in plaster dust, was the wooden folding ruler my grandfather had given me when I was 12. 9 days earlier, my parents had taken $18,000 from the account I'd been using to pay for my wedding. They said my younger brother, Luke, had made a mistake at our grandfather's apartment building. He'd opened up the wrong wall, damaged a pipe, and created an emergency so serious that a contractor needed money that morning. We didn't have time to hold a family meeting, my mother had told me. We had to fix what Luke did. That was the first lie. The photos proved the work had started 5 weeks before Luke's supposed mistake. They also proved this wasn't a repair. It was a full renovation. What they didn't prove, at least not yet, was why my brother's company name was printed on the permit board, why a contractor I'd never hired believed I was the architect of record, or where 6 years of rent from that building had actually gone. By the time I had answers, my parents would offer to put the $18,000 back. They'd offer me part of the building too. For about 20 minutes, I wanted to say yes. If you've ever been called the capable one right before somebody handed you a crisis they created, you probably understand why I didn't see the trap right away. Tell me in the comments if that role sounds familiar. Just don't decide what you think of Luke yet, because the people who built this system were much better at hiding inside it than he was. My name is Tessa Morgan. I was 39 when this happened, and I'm a residential architect in Richmond, Virginia. I don't design enormous glass houses for people who own helicopters. Most of my work is older homes, small apartment buildings, and the kind of additions where a family wants a second bathroom but doesn't want the new part to look like it landed in the yard from outer space. I'm good at seeing how things carry weight. You learn pretty quickly that a crack doesn't always start where it appears. Water can travel. Floors can hide damage. A door that suddenly won't close might be telling you something about a beam 20 feet away. People do that too, although it took me longer to learn. My fiancé, David, teaches band at a public high school. He can get 60 14-year-olds with instruments to enter on the same beat, which makes him calmer than any human being has a right to be. We met when I was reviewing plans for an accessibility renovation at his school. He disagreed with where I'd placed a storage wall, and instead of becoming defensive, I went home thinking about him. 2 years later, he proposed in our kitchen while a tray of garlic bread burned behind him. It was perfect. We were planning a small October wedding at a renovated tobacco warehouse outside the city. 48 guests. Dinner at one long table. No bridesmaids, no matching robes, no choreographed entrance. David cared about the music. I cared about the food and whether the old floor could handle the rental company's tables without wobbling. The full budget was just under $29,000. We'd saved separately and agreed to split it. My share sat in an account at Tidewater Community Credit Union that my mother had opened with me when I was 16. Yes, my mother was still a joint owner on one of my bank accounts when I was 39 years old. I know. Believe me, I've had that conversation with myself. The account had started with money from my summer job at a drafting supply store. Later, it held my college emergency fund. Then it became the place where I saved for a down payment I never used because I moved to Richmond. When David and I got engaged, I renamed it Wedding in my banking app and started sending $800 there every month. Mom's name stayed on it mostly because taking her off required both of us to appear at a branch. Every time I visited my parents in Norfolk, there was some more urgent family task waiting. That sentence explains more of my life than I understood at the time. My parents, Elaine and Paul Morgan, lived in the same pale yellow house where Luke and I grew up. Dad had retired from managing a commercial flooring warehouse. Mom had worked part-time at a dental office until she began referring to herself as the family coordinator, a title nobody gave her but everybody obeyed. Luke was 4 years younger than me. He was charming in a way that made people feel as if a better version of their day had just arrived. He remembered bartenders' names. He could make a 7-year-old laugh and a bank manager extend a deadline in the same afternoon. He'd also started 3 businesses in 10 years, and somehow every one of them required a final emergency contribution from our parents. His most recent company was called North Pier Properties. He described himself as a developer. At that point, he'd renovated 1 bungalow, consulted on a coffee shop, and made a beautiful website. The apartment building in the contractor's photos was called Harbor House. My grandfather bought it in 1978. It was a 3-story brick building in Norfolk with 6 apartments, wide front steps, and a little stone heron carved above the entry. It wasn't grand, but it had good bones. Grandpa George did most of the maintenance himself, and when I was a kid, I'd follow him through the building carrying a coffee can full of screws. He gave me the folding ruler one August afternoon when we were repairing a pantry door in apartment 2B. It was made of yellowed wood with brass hinges and dark blue numbers. One end had a paint stain shaped like a thumbprint. I measured the opening and announced that it was 24 inches. Grandpa measured it again and got 23 7/8. Close enough, I said. He looked over his glasses at me. The wood doesn't care what you meant, Tess. Measure what's there. Then he folded the ruler, tucked it into my back pocket, and told me to keep it. For years, I thought that was the moment I decided to become an architect. Maybe it was. But it was also the moment my family realized I liked being useful. In my family, usefulness was the most reliable way to earn a place in the room. Dad had a phrase he used whenever one of us started comparing who had done what. You don't measure what you do for family. It sounded generous, almost noble. When I was 17 and Luke backed Mom's car into a concrete post, I spent the weekend helping Dad replace the bumper instead of going to a statewide design competition. You don't measure what you do for family. When I was 23 and Luke needed somewhere to stay after dropping out of his second college program, he moved into my 1-bedroom apartment for 4 months. I slept on a fold-out chair because he said the couch hurt his back. You don't measure what you do for family. When I was 28 and Grandpa's roof at Harbor House started leaking, I drew the repair details, met 3 contractors, and used $8,600 from my down payment savings to cover the part my parents said they couldn't pay. Mom promised it would count toward my share of the building someday. Dad said we didn't need to put family promises in a contract. And I, an architect who would never advise a client to spend $1 without a written agreement, said okay. I wish I could make that decision sound less ridiculous. I can't. The truth is, Harbor House wasn't just property to me. It was where Grandpa taught me how old buildings worked. It was the only place in my childhood where being curious didn't become being difficult. When my parents said the building would eventually belong to Luke and me, I heard something underneath the words. They trust you. You belong here. All the work counts. After Grandpa died, Mom inherited Harbor House outright. For the next 10 years, I became its unpaid architect, emergency coordinator, and unofficial property manager from 90 miles away. If a bathroom ceiling stained, the tenant called Mom called me, and I called the plumber. If the insurance company wanted photographs, I took them. If a contractor's estimate was vague, I rewrote the scope. I spent Saturday mornings on video calls asking Luke to point his phone at cracks while he complained that the basement smelled weird. Luke collected rent twice when Mom was on vacation and began calling himself Operations. That's not bitterness. That is literally what happened. The pattern wasn't always dramatic enough to look like favoritism. It was usually 100 small accommodations arranged so Luke's life had soft edges. When his restaurant failed, my parents said the economy had crushed him. When I was laid off during the same downturn, Mom said she wasn't worried because I always landed on my feet. When Luke got divorced, Dad drove to his house every Thursday for 9 months to watch his daughter, Sadie. When I had surgery to remove a benign ovarian cyst, Mom texted David for updates because hospital parking made her anxious. I told people that story like it was funny. My mother has a medical phobia, I'd say. She doesn't. She had spent 3 nights sleeping in a vinyl chair when Luke had his appendix out at 19. Still, I protected the explanation because the alternative hurt more. The strangest little habit I developed was putting on shoes before answering a family call after 9 at night. I could be in pajamas. I could be sick. It didn't matter. If Mom's name lit up my screen at 9:14, I'd slide my feet into sneakers before I answered because some part of me assumed I'd be driving, fixing, or meeting somebody at an emergency room. David noticed it about 6 months after we moved in together. "Why are you wearing shoes?" he asked one night. I was standing in the kitchen with my phone ringing in my hand. "It's my mom." He waited for the rest of the answer. I didn't have one. The call about the $18,000 came at 7:36 on a Tuesday morning, so at least I was already dressed. I was packing samples for a client meeting when Mom said, "Before you react, everybody is safe." There are sentences that make your body understand danger before your brain does. That's one of them. What happened? Luke opened a wall at Harbor House and hit an old pipe. There's water damage in 3A, and the ceiling below it is bowing. I set down the tile sample in my hand. Why was Luke opening a wall? He was checking the bathroom. I don't know the construction language, Tessa. Was the water shut off? Yes. A contractor is there. Which contractor? She exhaled. Not scared. Annoyed. That was the first thing that didn't fit. Owen Price, she said. Your dad found him. He says they need temporary support and plumbing work immediately. It's $18,000. Send me his estimate. We don't have time for you to review every line. If a ceiling is bowing, you absolutely have time for somebody to review the structural work. Then Dad came on the phone. My parents did that sometimes. One would begin a conversation, and the other would appear halfway through like management had been called. Tess, it's handled, Dad said. The contractor can start this morning. Then what do you need from me? There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. Long enough. We moved $18,000 from the credit union account, he said. I honestly didn't understand which account he meant. Then I did. I opened the banking app while he was still talking. My wedding account had held $23,417 the night before. The available balance was now $5,417. Exactly $18,000 had been transferred at 7:02 that morning to an account ending in 8041. Put it back. Mom picked up another phone or moved closer to Dad's. Tessa, don't do this right now. Put my money back. Luke made a mistake, she said. The building can't sit there getting damaged while we schedule a committee meeting. You had enough time to access my account. My name is on it. There it was. Not an apology. Not even an acknowledgement. A technicality. I could hear Dad telling her to let him handle it. We'll replace it when Luke refinances, he said. Before the wedding. What is Luke refinancing? Another pause. His business line, Dad said. Why would his business line repay work at Mom's building? Because he's responsible for the mistake. It was circular, and they kept saying it with the confidence of people who assumed confidence could replace an answer. I asked for photographs. Mom said the workers were busy. I asked for the contractor's number. Dad said he'd send it after they got the situation stable. I asked why insurance wasn't involved. Mom said they didn't want a claim on the property. Every answer closed one door and opened 3 more. David came into the kitchen while I was still on the phone. He looked at my face, then at the banking app, and pulled out the chair beside me. Dad was saying, You know we would never take something from you. This is temporary. You already took it. We moved it. Without asking me. Because there was an emergency. Created by Luke. Mom cut in. Exactly. So why are you making this harder for everybody? That question was so upside down that I had to look at David to make sure I'd heard it correctly. I told them I wanted the estimate, photos, and proof of payment by noon. Dad agreed so quickly that I knew he just wanted me off the phone. Then Mom said the sentence she'd been saving. You don't measure what you do for family, Tessa. I looked down at the number on my screen. 18,000 was a very precise thing not to measure. After we hung up, David didn't say anything for almost a minute. He poured coffee into the mug I'd forgotten to fill and slid it toward me. Can she do that? He asked. Legally? Probably. She's a joint owner. I'm not asking legally. I know. Did they ask? No. Did Luke call you? No. Have you seen one picture of this emergency? No. He nodded slowly. Then it isn't an emergency you're helping with. It's a decision they made for you. I hated that sentence because it was clean. My family worked best in fog. David had a way of opening a window. At noon, Dad sent me a 1-page estimate from Price & Sons Construction. The scope said demolition, structural framing, plumbing relocation, debris removal, initial material deposit. It did not mention water damage, emergency shoring, Unit 3A, or a bowed ceiling. The estimate was dated June 3rd. The call was July 12th. I read the date 3 times. Then I called Dad. Why is this estimate 5 weeks old? He said, Owen reused an old form. The project number is printed beside the date. You'll have to ask him. Give me his number. He's working. So am I. Dad lowered his voice. Can you please not turn this into some professional interrogation? Luke feels terrible. That was another family trick. The person who caused the problem got feelings. The person paying for it got instructions. I asked to speak to Luke. Dad said he was overwhelmed. At 2:18 that afternoon, Luke finally sent me a text. I screwed up. I'm sorry. I'll make it right. I replied with one question. What exactly did you do? He didn't answer. At 5, Mom called to tell me the contractor had started and the building was safe. Her voice had that bright, efficient tone she used after getting her way. See, she said. No reason for everyone to panic. I told her the money needed to be returned within 72 hours. From where? That's not my problem. It becomes your problem if Harbor House loses value. Half of it is supposed to be yours. That sentence worked on me exactly the way she knew it would. Half of it is supposed to be yours. Not legally. Not in writing. Not today. Someday. My entire relationship with that building lived inside that word. I told myself the money was protecting an asset I would eventually own. I told myself Luke really had made a stupid mistake. I told myself my parents had panicked, and panicked people made bad choices. Then I made one of my own. I told Mom I wouldn't contact the bank if they sent me a repayment plan by Friday. David didn't argue when I told him. That was worse. Say it, I said. You don't need me to. I want to hear it. He leaned against the counter. You're giving them 3 days to invent a better explanation. I'm giving them a chance to fix it. Those might be the same thing. Friday came with no repayment plan. Mom sent a photograph of a handwritten note on yellow paper that said, We, Paul and Elaine Morgan, acknowledge $18,000 owed to Tessa Morgan, to be repaid after refinancing. No date for the refinance. No interest. No payment schedule. No explanation of what was being refinanced. At the bottom, Mom had drawn a heart. Apparently the heart was collateral. I moved the remaining $5,417 into a new account at a different bank. I removed Mom from the credit union account. I changed the passwords on the email address I used for Harbor House. And I sent my parents and Luke a short message stating that I would not approve, coordinate, review, or pay for any work at the building until I received the project documents and a written explanation. That was my first real boundary. It was 4 sentences long. I still shook after I sent it. Mom replied, This is hurtful. Luke wrote, Understood. Dad called twice and left no voicemail. For the next several days, nobody mentioned the money. Instead, Mom texted me about wedding invitations, as if she'd misplaced a centerpiece rather than $18,000. She asked whether I'd chosen napkin colors. She sent a picture of shoes she might wear. On Sunday, she wrote, Your father still needs the measurements for the ceremony arbor. Dad had offered to build it using cedar grandpa stored behind Harbor House. He'd been sketching it for months. I wanted that arbor more than I wanted to admit. I wanted my father to stand under something he'd made and look proud to be there. That was the emotional math my parents understood better than any bank statement. If they could keep the wedding conversation normal, maybe I'd choose the family picture over the missing money. On Thursday morning, 9 days after the withdrawal, I received an email at work from Owen Price. The subject line was Harbor House Phase 1, Progress Photos and Change Order. The message began, Hi Tessa, Paul said to keep copying you on design decisions. I had never spoken to Owen Price in my life. There were 27 photographs attached. I opened the first one. And that is where this story actually began. Architects receive progress photos all the time. You learn to scan them in layers. First, you look at the work itself. Then the conditions around it. Then all the little things nobody meant to photograph. Photo 1 showed the wall between the living room and kitchen in 3A had been removed. There was no burst pipe. No wet drywall. No water staining. Temporary posts supported the ceiling, but they were arranged for planned structural work, not an emergency response. Photo 2 showed Luke beside a stack of new black-framed windows. Behind him, somebody had painted a sample of deep green on the wall and written, Executive Suite in chalk. Photo 3 was the one with my drawings. They were concept sketches I'd prepared 6 years earlier, after Mom asked what Harbor House might look like with larger kitchens and accessible first-floor units. Every sheet had a diagonal note across the bottom that said preliminary, not for construction. In Owen's photo, that note had been covered by a new digital title strip. The strip called the project Harbor House Furnished Residences. Client, North Pier Properties, LLC. Project Architect, Tessa Morgan, AIA. It included my state license number. Photo 4 showed the permit board near the front entrance. Luke's company was listed as the owner. The permit description said, Interior renovation and conversion of 6 dwelling units. Photo 5 was dated June 4th. Luke's mistake supposedly happened July 12th. Photo 6 showed 4 brand new kitchen cabinets still wrapped in plastic. Photo 7 showed a rendering taped to the stairwell wall. It had a logo with the stone heron from the front of the building and the words "Flexible Luxury Stays Coming Fall." By photo 10, my hands had gone cold. Not because I was surprised my parents had lied. I think some part of me had accepted that days earlier. It was the scale of the preparation. You don't order custom windows in a panic. You don't create a brand package during a plumbing emergency. You don't empty 6 apartments, commission renderings, alter architectural drawings, and date an estimate 5 weeks early because somebody opened the wrong wall on Tuesday. The last 3 photos were close-ups of objects found during demolition. One showed old postcards tucked behind the baseboard in 3A. Another showed Grandpa's dented metal coffee can full of square nails. The last showed his folding ruler. I'd left it in the locked maintenance cabinet after measuring windows there the previous fall. Luke knew it mattered to me. He'd once joked that if the building caught fire, I would rescue that ruler before him. Owen's email ended with, "Also, can you approve the attached steel beam change and confirm whether you want us to save the old ruler and postcards?" Luke said it's probably junk, but I wanted to ask. I called him before I finished reading. "Price and Sons." A man answered over the sound of a saw. "Is this Owen Price?" "Yes. This is Tessa Morgan." His tone changed immediately. "Hey, great. Did you get the pictures?" "I did. I need you to stop work involving my drawings." The saw kept running in the background. "I'm sorry. I am not the architect for Harbor House. I did not prepare a permit set. I did not authorize anyone to alter my concept sketches. And I have never approved a steel beam for that building." He didn't answer. Then the saw stopped. "Paul said you were involved from the design side." "Paul is my father. He is not authorized to hire me. Your information is on the plans." "I can see that. Luke said you were family partners." "We aren't." I could hear him moving, maybe walking away from the crew. "Okay," he said. "I need a minute here." "So do I." "Who gave you the PDF?" "Paul emailed it." Luke signed the construction contract. "When?" "May 26th. 7 weeks before the emergency." I asked whether there had ever been a burst pipe. "Not while we've been here." "A bowed ceiling?" "The third-floor joists were undersized around an old opening, but we found that during demolition. That's why I sent the change order. So Luke didn't accidentally open the wrong wall on July 12th. Owen was quiet. "I wasn't there July 12th, he said. "We'd been waiting on the second deposit. Your dad paid it that morning, and we came back the next day. There was the $18,000. Not emergency money. A scheduled construction deposit they didn't have. I asked Owen to send me the contract, the complete drawing file he'd received, and every email containing my name. He hesitated, understandably. He worked for Luke, not me. So I kept it simple. My professional license is being represented on a project I did not authorize. You need to preserve whatever you were given." He said he'd call his attorney and stop structural work until someone supplied a legitimate design. Then he asked, "Are you saying these plans are fake?" "I'm saying somebody took 6-year-old sketches and removed the warning that said not to build from them." He let out a long breath. "That's not the answer I was hoping for." "Me neither." Before we hung up, I asked him to lock the ruler in his truck. That might sound like a strange priority in that moment. My money was gone. My name was on altered plans. My family had spent months building a lie around me. But asking him to save the ruler was the first decision I made that day without considering what would be easiest for anybody else. Next, I opened the city property portal. The permit record was real, but it was only for non-structural interior demolition. No architect was listed. The structural work in the photos went beyond the approved scope. Then I checked the land records. Harbor House no longer belonged to my mother. 18 months earlier, Elaine Morgan had transferred it to North Pier Properties, LLC, for $10 and other valuable consideration. My brother owned North Pier. I stared at the deed until the words stopped looking like language. 18 months. During those 18 months, I'd paid $5,900 for a sewer line repair, drawn plans for a new rear stair, negotiated the roof warranty, and spent at least 80 unpaid hours handling tenant and contractor calls. 3 months after the transfer, Mom had told me, "Everything you put into Harbor House is building your future too." 6 months after the transfer, Dad had asked me to review the insurance renewal because you and Luke will have to understand this stuff when it's yours. 9 months after the transfer, Luke had called me at 10 at night because a tenant smelled gas. I drove to Norfolk, met the utility crew, and slept 2 hours on my parents' couch before driving back for a client presentation. The whole time, he owned the building. I printed the deed, although I don't know why. Maybe because paper made the betrayal feel less capable of changing shape. Then I called David. He was between summer rehearsals, and I could hear students talking in the band room. I found the building, I said. What do you mean? It belongs to Luke. He got quiet. Since when? A year and a half. Did you know? Would I be calling you like this if I knew? No. I'm sorry. That was a bad question. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead. They used my money to renovate his building. They used my drawings. They told the contractor I was involved. Where are you? My office. Are you alone? Mostly. I'm coming. You have students. I have a co-director. David, you don't need to leave work. He paused. Tessa, you're allowed to be the emergency. That did it. I made it through the photos, the deed, and the altered drawings without crying. One kind sentence from the person I loved, and I had to lock my office door. David arrived 25 minutes later with 2 sandwiches and a legal pad. He didn't tell me what to do. He sat across from me while I laid out the timeline. May 26th, Luke signs the contract. June 3rd, contractor issues deposit invoice. June 4th, demolition begins. July 12th, my parents take $18,000 and invent a plumbing emergency. July 21st, Owen sends photos to the person he believes is the project architect. Then David asked the question I should have asked years earlier. If Harbor House has 6 apartments, where does the rent go? The average rent had been around $1,100. Even with vacancies, taxes, insurance, and repairs, the building should have produced some cash. Yet every major expense had been presented to me as a crisis. The roof had no reserve. The sewer line had no reserve. The insurance premium had no reserve. When I asked, Mom always said Grandpa had kept rents too low and old buildings ate money. Both things were partly true, which made the answer easy to accept. But they didn't explain everything. I still had authorized access to the property management portal because I'd set it up for Mom. I did not have access to the operating bank account, but the portal showed payment records. Every month, one transfer appeared before any other bill. $1,986 to Atlantic Coastal Bank. The description said Deed of Trust 4419. I searched the land records again. For years earlier, my parents had borrowed $210,000 against Harbor House. I remembered that year very well. It was the year Luke's restaurant closed. The place had been called Brackish, which was, in retrospect, an ambitious name for a seafood restaurant that lasted 14 months. Luke had signed a personal guarantee on the lease and owed vendors, the landlord, and the state. My parents told me they'd used part of Dad's retirement savings to settle everything. Mom cried when she said it. Dad told me Luke would spend the rest of his life making it up to them. 3 weeks later, they asked me to cover Harbor House's roof repair because their savings were tied up. They hadn't used retirement money. They'd borrowed against the building. The rent wasn't disappearing into maintenance. It was paying Luke's old business debt. My repair money kept the property operating while its income rescued him. Then my parents transferred the remaining asset to him too. I said the total out loud. Between repairs, materials, inspections, and one insurance deductible, I had put $42,600 into Harbor House over 10 years. That did not include my labor. It did not include the $18,000 from the wedding account. It did not include the interest I lost, or the weekends, or the nights I put on shoes before answering the phone. David looked at the legal pad. That's over $60,000. You don't measure what you do for family, I said. For the first time, the phrase sounded less like generosity and more like an instruction to destroy the receipt. I called my parents and asked them to meet me at Harbor House the next morning. Mom said they could come to Richmond Sunday instead. I said, tomorrow. 10 o'clock. Bring Luke. Your brother has Sadie. Then he can find childcare. Tessa, your tone is really concerning me. My license number is on fake construction drawings. My tone is the least concerning part of your day. She stopped talking. That was new. At 10 the next morning, I stood on the front steps of Harbor House with David beside me. The stone heron over the entry had a crack through one wing. I'd submitted a repair scope for it 2 years earlier, but Mom said there wasn't money for decorative work. There was now a brass sign on the door that said Harbor Furnished Residences, coming soon. Mom arrived first in a white linen blouse, dressed as if we were meeting a wedding florist. Dad parked behind her. Luke came 10 minutes late in his black pickup and left the engine running while he finished a phone call. When he finally walked over, he opened his arms like he planned to hug me. I stepped back. "Okay," he said. "I deserved that. Unlock the door." Mom glanced at David. "I thought this was a family conversation." "It is," I said. It was the first time I'd said that about David in front of them without adding basically or soon. Luke unlocked the building. The inside smelled like cut wood, dust, and old plaster. Every apartment door stood open. The hallway carpet was gone. The banister Grandpa polished every spring was wrapped in plastic. Mom walked into 3A and immediately began explaining the design. "The kitchens will be so much brighter. Luke has a corporate housing company interested in renting all 6. She sounded proud. Not guilty. Proud. I held up the deed. "When were you going to tell me?" Dad looked at Luke. Luke looked at Mom. Mom said, "After the project was stabilized. The property was transferred 18 months ago. We didn't want to create tension before there was anything concrete to discuss." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. My body just rejected the sentence. "You gave him a building." "We gave him an opportunity," Dad said. "You told me it would be split between us." That was before circumstances changed. "Whose circumstances?" Nobody answered. I turned to Luke. "Did you know they never told me?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom said you didn't want to be tied to Norfolk. I live 90 miles away. That isn't exile. She said you didn't want rental property. I said I didn't want to manage it alone while owning none of it. That's not how it was presented to me." Mom stepped between us without physically moving. "This is exactly why we waited. The two of you hear everything as competition." "No," I said. "You give us different information and then call the disagreement competition." Luke's eyes moved toward her. That was the first moment I saw something shift in him. Not remorse. Not yet. Confusion. I asked whether he knew Harbor House had secured the loan for his restaurant debt. He said, "What loan?" Dad stared at the exposed floor. Mom said, "We are not relitigating Brackish. I'm not asking you. I'm asking Luke." Luke looked at Dad. "You said you used the retirement account." Dad finally spoke. "We did what we had to do." "You borrowed $210,000 against this building," I said. "Then you had me pay repairs because the rent was covering his debt." Luke's face tightened. "I didn't know that. You knew I was paying for repairs. I knew you helped. $42,600. He blinked. Mom said, "That number includes things from years ago." "Yes, Mom. That's how totals work." David looked down. I think he was hiding a smile, which I appreciated more than I can explain. I showed them the altered drawings. Dad said he hadn't altered anything. He'd asked one of Luke's marketing people to clean up the old sheets. "You removed the warning and added my license number." "The drawings were yours," Mom said. "We assumed that meant the design was yours. A grocery list in my handwriting doesn't authorize you to open a restaurant." Luke took the sheets from me and studied the title block. "I never saw the original warning," he said. "But you signed a construction contract naming me as architect. Dad said you were helping from Richmond. Did you call me once?" He didn't answer. "Did you send one email?" I thought they had handled it. There it was. Luke's operating system in one sentence. He thought they had handled it. For most of his life, they had. I wanted him to be the villain because anger is easier when it has one address. But standing in that gutted apartment, I could see that Luke was both beneficiary and product of the same system. He wasn't innocent. He had accepted a building without asking what happened to my half. He had watched me pay. He had signed documents he hadn't read because he believed somebody else would absorb the risk. But my parents had spent years telling each of us a different story. To me, Luke was fragile and needed time. To Luke, I was successful and uninterested. To the rest of the family, our parents had sacrificed equally for both children. The truth was that every resource flowed toward the person least likely to hold it, while every responsibility flowed toward the person least likely to drop it. "The 18,000 wasn't for an emergency," I said. Dad pressed his lips together. Mom answered, "It was an emergency to us. The contractor was going to walk off the job. Because you couldn't make a scheduled payment. The distinction doesn't change the need. It changes the lie. We knew you'd say no if we asked." That sentence landed harder than everything before it. They hadn't acted too quickly to ask. They had chosen not to ask because my answer mattered less than my balance. I said, "You didn't borrow my wedding money to save this building. You used it to finish giving him what you told me was partly mine. Mom's face changed then. Not shame. Injury. After everything we've done for you, I cannot believe you're reducing this family to money. You reduced me to funding. Dad told both of us to lower our voices, even though neither of us was shouting. Luke sat down on an unopened box of tile. What happens now? He asked. For once, everybody looked at me before they had decided what I should do. I said the contractor could not use my drawings. My name had to be removed from every document, website, lender package, and permit application. A licensed structural professional needed to assess the removed wall. And the $18,000 had to be returned within 10 business days. Mom said, "Or what?" My stomach tightened. The old version of me would have softened the answer. She would have said, "I don't want it to come to that." She would have offered another deadline before anybody accused her of being cruel. I looked at my mother. "Or I protect myself without your permission." Dad stepped toward me. "Tess, come on. I'm done for today." Mom followed us into the hallway. "What about the wedding?" she asked. It was such a revealing question. Not, "What about our relationship?" Not, "How do we repair this?" What about the event where people would notice if the family picture had a hole in it? I said, "The wedding is still happening." "With what money?" David turned around before I could. "Ours," he said. One word. Calm as a downbeat. Mom stopped following us. On the drive back to Richmond, I kept waiting to feel powerful. Instead, I felt sick. I had wanted them to deny the deed was real. I had wanted Dad to pull out another document and say there had been a misunderstanding. I had even wanted Luke to admit he'd manipulated them, because then my parents could still be the people I'd spent my life trying to impress. The actual truth was quieter. They knew I was reliable enough to survive being betrayed, and they had mistaken my ability to survive it for permission. The next morning, I called my professional liability insurer and an attorney named Priya Shah, who had reviewed contracts for my firm before. Priya listened without interrupting while I explained the altered drawings. Then she said, "I'm going to ask you a question you won't like. Did you ever give them permission to use the concepts for pricing?" 6 years ago, I emailed my mother a PDF so she could understand what a renovation might involve. Did the PDF say not for construction? On every page. Did you know work had started? No. Did you receive compensation? Unless you count having my wedding money taken, no. She paused. I don't. Priya told me I needed to notify the city in writing that my name and license number had been used without authorization. I also needed to send formal notice to Luke's company, my parents, the contractor, and the lender if my drawings had been submitted for financing. Will that stop the project? I asked. It may delay it. I closed my eyes. Even then, after everything, my first fear was what protecting myself would do to them. Priya must have heard it in my silence. Tessa, stopping unsafe or misrepresented work is not something you're doing to your family. The people who used your license created this consequence. I knew that professionally. Emotionally, I was still 12 years old, standing in a doorway with a ruler, trying to be accurate without making anybody mad. That afternoon, Owen sent the files his attorney allowed him to release. There were emails from Dad describing me as our architect and co-owner. There was a project summary Luke had given the lender stating that design services were an equity contribution from me. There was an invoice schedule showing the $18,000 payment as owner deposit 2, due July 1st. My parents had taken the money 11 days after it was already late. Most useful of all, Owen's original progress photographs still contained dates and location information. The construction timeline could not be explained away as a reused form. I sent the notices. Then I waited. Luke called first. The city put a hold on the framing inspection. I know. Owen pulled his crew. He needs proper drawings. Do you understand what carrying costs are doing to me every day this sits? Do you understand what a complaint against my license could do to me? I'm not filing a complaint. You aren't the only person who can. He was quiet for a second. I'm trying to fix this. No. You're trying to restart construction. Same thing right now. It isn't. He swore under his breath, then apologized. That was Luke all over. Even his anger wanted to remain likable. What do you want from me? He asked. The truth would be a nice change. He told me the version he'd been given. Mom and Dad had approached him 2 years earlier. They said Harbor House's debt was becoming difficult for them in retirement. Luke could take the building, renovate it, refinance the loan, and create enough income to support himself and Sadie. He asked about me. Mom said I had no intention of moving back to Norfolk and had already received far more support through college and my career. That part was creative. I had received a partial scholarship, worked during school, and left with $47,000 in loans. My parents paid $4,000 toward my first-year housing. I was grateful for it. Apparently, they'd spent the next 16 years turning it into a mythical trust fund whenever they needed the family balance sheet to look even. Luke said Mom also showed him an email where I'd written, "I don't want responsibility for that property anymore." I remembered the message. It followed a weekend when a failed water heater flooded 2 units, and Luke stopped answering his phone. The complete sentence was, "I don't want responsibility for that property anymore if I have no authority and no ownership." Mom had forwarded the first half. "Did that really sound like me giving you a building?" I asked. I wanted it to. It was the most honest thing he'd said. He admitted that he knew I had paid some repairs, but not how much. He knew my concepts were the basis for the renovation, but claimed Dad said he'd secured permission. He knew the project summary called me a co-owner. "Why didn't that bother you?" "Because Dad said you'd be added after the refinance." "Did you plan to add me?" His answer took too long. We hadn't worked out percentages. I almost laughed again. "So you knew enough to benefit from the confusion." "That's not fair." "It is exactly fair. That's why you don't like it." He asked me not to punish Sadie for decisions she didn't make. I told him I loved my niece and would never make her responsible for adult money. I also told him he didn't get to hold his daughter in front of every consequence like a shield. He hung up on me. Mom took a different approach. She sent me a long email titled A Mother's Heart. It included photographs from my childhood, a list of things my parents had paid for, and 3 paragraphs about how financial stress had changed my personality. The list included braces, school clothes, and a family trip to Disney World when I was 11. I was apparently expected to reimburse childhood retroactively, but forget adult theft immediately. Dad called David. He said Mom wasn't sleeping. He said I was endangering Luke's custody arrangement. He said the family couldn't survive public accusations involving fraud. David asked, "Has anyone returned the money?" Dad said that wasn't the point. David said, "It seems unusually close to the point." Then Dad accused him of turning me against the family. David, who had watched me answer midnight plumbing calls for 10 years, said, "Paul, if I could control Tessa, our garage would have shelves by now." That ended the conversation. The reputation campaign started quietly. An aunt called to ask why I was suing Luke over a misunderstanding. A cousin messaged that she hoped the wedding wasn't making me too focused on material things. Mom told people the ceremony might be postponed because David and I were having budget issues. I wasn't suing anyone. We hadn't postponed anything. But corrections travel slower than a worried mother with a contact list. I made one group message to the relatives who had contacted me. "The wedding is happening. I did not approve the use of my savings, drawings, name, or professional license for Luke's renovation. I am handling that privately and won't discuss it through other people. No screenshots. No deed. No itemized history." Mom wanted a public argument because then she could point to my tone instead of her conduct. I stopped giving her one. That did not mean I felt calm. I slept badly. I rehearsed conversations in the shower. I checked my professional email at 3 in the morning, convinced there would be a licensing complaint. Twice, I opened Mom's A Mother's Heart email and wondered whether I really had become cold. Guilt doesn't disappear when you recognize manipulation. Sometimes it just puts on a more respectable outfit. Meanwhile, David and I had to remake the wedding. The venue's next payment was due in 2 weeks. We could cover it from David's savings, but I refused. "I said we'd split this," I told him. "We are splitting a life. It won't happen 50-50 every Tuesday. I don't want you rescuing me. I'm not rescuing you. I'm marrying you." I still said no. That was my second mistake. I was so determined not to become dependent that I confused accepting love with owing somebody access. My family had taught me every gift came with a future assignment. David wasn't offering an assignment. We eventually canceled the warehouse, lost a $2,000 deposit, and moved the wedding to his sister May's backyard. We cut the guest list to 32, hired a local restaurant to make dinner, and borrowed tables from David's school. His students built music stands for the ceremony signs. May grew white cosmos along the fence. Our friend Javier offered to photograph the day as his gift. Every time somebody helped, I caught myself trying to repay them before they'd finished the sentence. Finally, May put both hands on my shoulders and said, Tessa, a gift is not an invoice wearing a bow. I wrote that down. 3 weeks before the wedding, my parents made their offer. Priya received it from an attorney representing North Pier. The proposal would return my $18,000 at the refinance closing. It would also grant me a 30% non-voting interest in Harbor House after construction was complete. In return, I would acknowledge that my early drawings had been provided for development, agree to serve as project architect for a fixed fee deferred until the building reached full occupancy, withdraw my notice to the city, and release my parents and Luke from all claims related to past contributions. There was also a confidentiality clause. Mom called 10 minutes after Priya forwarded it. "This gives you what you've always said you wanted," she told me. She wasn't wrong. That was what made it dangerous. Part of Harbor House. Recognition for my work. My wedding money returned. My name officially attached to the building Grandpa loved. Dad would finish the cedar arbor, Mom said. They would come to the wedding. We could stop tearing each other apart and rebuild as a family. All I had to do was turn their lie into paperwork. I wish I could say I rejected it immediately. I didn't. I asked Priya whether the agreement could be revised. She looked at me across her conference table. Legally or spiritually? You're an attorney. Don't say spiritually. Fine. Legally, almost anything can be revised. But I need to know what outcome you're asking me to create. Ownership. Of the building? I didn't answer. She waited. Of my place in it, I said. There it was. The thing under the money. I wanted proof that all those years had meant what my parents said they meant. I wanted them to admit I hadn't been foolish to trust them. I wanted Grandpa's building, yes, but I also wanted the family story in which my work had earned belonging. If you were in my position, would you have negotiated? I'm honestly curious. 30% of a valuable building and the money back can look a lot like justice when you've spent your whole life waiting for a seat. What I hadn't understood yet was that they weren't offering me a seat. They were offering me my old load with a nicer title. Priya revised the proposal anyway, because that was her job. Voting ownership immediately. Full repayment before any release. Separate compensation for design work. Independent structural review. No false statement about prior authorization. North Pier rejected it the same day. Luke called and said the lender wouldn't close with an ownership dispute and a city hold. Then resolve the dispute, I said. We tried. You tried to make me responsible for a project you already own. You'd get 30%. After I make your building legal, fundable, and profitable. That's what partnership is. No, Luke. That's what I've already been doing for free. 2 days later, Dad drove to Richmond alone. He brought the cedar boards for the arbor strapped to his truck. For a second, when I saw them, I thought he had chosen me. He stood in our driveway with his hands in his pockets and said Mom was too upset to come. I can finish this by Saturday, he said, nodding toward the wood. If we can get everything settled. There was no need to ask what settled meant. Is the arbor a gift or a condition? He looked hurt. Why would you ask me that? Because you drove 90 miles with a contract in your truck. His eyes shifted toward the cab. I almost smiled. Dad was many things, but he had never been good at hiding paperwork. He pulled out a folder and set it on the hood. The agreement was the original version with 2 sentences changed. The 30% would vest after refinance instead of full occupancy. I still had to acknowledge the drawings and release every past claim. Luke could lose the building, Dad said. Your mother and I could lose our retirement. We made choices under pressure. That doesn't make us criminals. I didn't call you criminals. Your letters use words like unauthorized and misrepresentation. Because those are accurate. Accuracy isn't always kindness. That sentence could have come from the center of my childhood. I looked at the cedar. Dad had planed the boards smooth. He'd marked each joint in pencil. If I signed, he would build the arbor. My parents would stand under it. Mom would adjust my veil. Dad would walk me toward David, and the photographs would look like the family I'd been trying to earn. For maybe 20 minutes, I let myself imagine it. Then I read the first page again. My name appeared 11 times. Luke's appeared 4. My obligations filled 3 pages. My ownership fit in 1 paragraph and depended on a loan I did not control. The structure was familiar. They got the asset. I got the responsibility. They got immediate relief. I got a promise about later. The document wasn't a compromise. It was my childhood with signature lines. I closed the folder. I wanted a place in this family, I told Dad. You brought me a job. That's not fair. Fair is not the same as comfortable. He picked up the folder. If you don't help us, there may not be anything left for anyone. Then there isn't. My voice shook when I said it. That's important. I didn't transform into some untouchable woman who felt nothing. I was terrified. I wanted to take the sentence back before it reached him. But I didn't. Dad unstrapped the cedar and left it in our driveway. He drove away without saying whether he'd attend the wedding. The following week, Atlantic Coastal Bank scheduled a project resolution meeting at Harbor House. The refinance application identified me as a design partner, so Priya insisted I attend and correct the record directly. We met in apartment 3A, the unit from the photographs. Temporary supports divided the room. Rain tapped against plastic over one window. A folding table had been set up beneath the exposed joists. Luke was there with his attorney. My parents sat together. Owen came with his project manager. The bank sent a vice president named Marlene Brooks and an outside construction consultant. Nobody looked dramatic. That is what real reckonings often look like. Paper coffee cups. Wet coats. People checking the time. Marlene asked one direct question. Ms. Morgan, did you authorize your drawings and professional credentials to be used for this project? No. Luke's attorney began to qualify the answer. Priya held up one hand. I placed the original PDF beside the altered version. The warning across my sheets was obvious. Then Owen displayed the email from Dad attaching the altered file. Dad stared at his coffee. Marlene asked when I learned construction had started. July 21st, when Mr. Price sent me progress photos. She looked at the application. This document says you contributed design services in May. I did not. And the $18,000 owner deposit? Came from my wedding account without my consent after it was already overdue. Mom said, my name was legally on that account. Marlene turned to her. That wasn't my question. Mom folded her hands and said nothing else. Owen walked through the photograph dates. The consultant explained that the removed wall required a new analysis and permit. Priya submitted the deed timeline, my notices, and the proposal asking me to retroactively acknowledge the work. Nobody gasped. Nobody gave a speech. Marlene read the proposal twice. Owen's project manager rolled a pen between his palms. Luke stared through the open wall into what had been a kitchen. Then Dad said, very quietly, we thought she'd come around once she had ownership. Luke looked at him. You told me she had already agreed. Dad didn't answer. That silence did more than anything I could have said. For the first time, Luke heard my version, and his version collide in front of someone our parents couldn't manage. Marlene closed the loan file. The bank would not proceed with the refinance. Not because I demanded punishment, but because the application contained inaccurate ownership and project information, the approved scope did not match the work, and the budget no longer covered completion. Luke asked for 30 days to secure new plans and financing. The bank already held the first mortgage. Payments were 2 months behind. Marlene gave him the contact information for the workout department. Mom turned to me after the meeting. Are you happy now? I looked around the apartment. Grandpa's pantry wall was gone. The floor was cut open. Rainwater had begun darkening the edge of a plywood sheet. No, I said. That's the part you never understood. I had not wanted to win against them. I had wanted them to stop requiring me to lose. The project never restarted under North Pier. For months later, Harbor House was sold to a local housing company that kept 4 apartments as long-term rentals and rebuilt the 2 damaged units. The sale paid the bank, the contractor, the taxes, and the structural repairs. There wasn't enough left to create the fortune Luke had imagined. There was enough to settle with me. My parents returned the full $18,000 and reimbursed $21,000 of the recent repair costs I could document. It wasn't everything I'd put in. It didn't pay for 10 years of labor. Priya could probably have pushed harder. But I chose a clean ending over another year tied to their decisions. The money arrived 12 days after our wedding. Our wedding was smaller than the one we'd planned and better in almost every way. David and I walked into May's backyard together. No one gave me away. His students played an arrangement of At Last that wobbled in 2 places and made me cry in both. The borrowed tables didn't match. The cosmos leaned sideways after a windy morning. Dinner was hot, everyone fit, and not one person there expected me to earn my chair. Dad came alone. He sat in the 3rd row and left before dessert. He didn't build the arbor, but David and I made a simple one from the cedar he'd left in our driveway. For the first time in my life, I let somebody else read the instructions while I held the board. Mom did not attend. She sent a card saying she was sorry, money had come between us. I didn't answer that sentence. Money hadn't come between us. Money had revealed what was already there. Luke and I went 6 months without speaking. Then he called, not to ask for help, which mattered. He apologized for accepting the building without demanding a clear answer about me. He also admitted he'd ignored things because the version our parents gave him was convenient. It wasn't a perfect apology. He still said we all made mistakes once, and I made him identify mine. He couldn't. We're in limited contact now. I see Sadie separately, and Luke no longer sends repair questions disguised as casual conversation. He works for an established commercial builder, where somebody other than our parents reviews his contracts. Honestly, it's been good for him. Dad and I talk about once a month. Sometimes he takes responsibility. Sometimes he retreats into, we were trying to help both our children. I no longer argue with the version of him that needs to believe that. Mom and I exchange birthday messages. Forgiveness may come eventually. Access will not arrive ahead of it. Owen returned Grandpa's folding ruler at the bank meeting. He'd wrapped it in a clean shop towel so the plaster dust wouldn't get on my bag. For a while, I kept it in a drawer. Then, the next spring, David and I bought a little brick house with a crooked sunroom. On our first Saturday there, we decided to build a bench beneath the windows. I unfolded Grandpa's ruler and measured the opening. David wrote down the number. Then I measured it again, because Grandpa had been right about wood and intention. But this time, I wasn't measuring what I'd done for somebody else. I wasn't calculating whether enough sacrifice might finally become love. I was measuring a space we had chosen, in a home where help could be given without becoming a debt. For years, my family called me strong when what they really meant was available. I'm still strong. I'm just no longer available for that. If this story felt familiar, subscribe and share it with the person in your family who's always expected to carry what everyone else drops.